History often teaches us that wars end with surrender papers, shattered cities, and defeated armies. But some of the most decisive battles are fought far from the front lines, inside private homes, behind closed doors, in the final minutes of a man's life. This is not the story of a battlefield victory or a grand defeat. It is the story of a quiet execution, disguised as honor, and of a boy who carried the truth through silence, captivity, and time itself. On October 14, 1944, the Third Reich did not lose a general to enemy fire. It erased one of its own and forced his son to become a living witness to a lie that would echo for generations. On the morning of October 14, 1944, Erwin Rommel told his 15-year-old son that he had 15 minutes left to live. Adolf Hitler had sent 2 generals to Rommel's home with a final ultimatum: swallow cyanide or face a public trial that would not only destroy him, but annihilate his family as well. Rommel chose the poison. What makes this moment different from every other collapse of the Nazi elite is what came next. That 15-year-old boy would spend the next 70 years reshaping the Rommel name into something his father's regime would have despised. No longer a symbol of conquest, but of reconciliation, restraint, and liberal democracy. The day began quietly at the Rommel Villa in Herrlingen. Rommel was still recovering from catastrophic head injuries sustained 3 months earlier when Allied aircraft strafed his staff car. He walked with difficulty, one eye no longer closed properly. Survival itself had become his crime. For the Nazi leadership, a wounded Rommel was more dangerous alive than dead. At noon, 2 visitors arrived: General Wilhelm Burgdorf and General Ernst Meisel. They were not there to check on his health. Rommel met them in private for nearly an hour. When he emerged, his expression revealed nothing. He went upstairs to find his wife, Lucy. What he told her would make her a widow before the hour ended. Then he called for his son, Manfred. Rommel explained that dying at the hands of one's own countrymen was harder than any battlefield death. The house was surrounded. Gestapo agents waited in the nearby woods. Hitler had formally accused him of high treason, tying his name to the July 20th plot, the failed attempt to assassinate the Führer. Rommel had known some of the conspirators. Whether he actively participated remains debated, but Hitler had already rendered his verdict, and under the Third Reich, judgment was absolute. The choice was laid out with chilling clarity. If Rommel took the cyanide, the regime would announce his death as a result of complications from his injuries. He would receive a full state funeral, military honors. His family would be spared, their pension secured, but if he refused, if he demanded a trial, his wife and son would be destroyed along with him. The Nazis had been explicit about the fate of traitors' families. At 12:15 p.m., Rommel told Manfred that he would be dead within 15 minutes. Outside, the Gestapo waited. Escape was impossible. Resistance meant immediate execution. The cyanide was never truly a choice. It was theater, a performance designed to grant the regime deniability. Rommel dressed carefully. He put on his Afrika Korps jacket. He took his field marshal's baton. He said goodbye to his wife and son. Then he entered the car with Burgdorf and Meisel. They drove only a short distance before stopping. At 12:35 p.m., the telephone rang at the villa. Rommel was dead. The official cause would be recorded as a cerebral embolism resulting from his July injuries. A 15-year-old boy now carried one of the most dangerous secrets of the war. Germany's most celebrated general had been murdered by his own government, and telling the truth could get his entire family killed. 4 days later, tens of thousands lined the streets of Ulm in silent salute. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt delivered the eulogy, praising Rommel's loyalty to the Führer and the fatherland. The coffin was draped in the Nazi flag. Military bands played. It was one of the grandest state funerals of the war. Every word was a lie. The regime honored a man it had just forced to commit suicide. It praised his loyalty after accusing him of treason. It celebrated his service while his body still carried the poison they had made him swallow. Lucy and Manfred stood among the mourners, knowing the truth and saying nothing, not from cowardice, but because silence was the price of survival. Rommel had taken the poison so they would not have to die as well. The truth would wait. 6 months later, the war was collapsing. In April 1945, French forces swept into southwestern Germany. Manfred, now 16, had been conscripted into the Reich labor service. As Allied troops advanced, he made a decision. He deserted. The French captured him anyway, along with thousands of other young Germans. He was processed as a prisoner of war and interrogated, but his name drew attention. Rommel, Son of the Desert Fox. General Jean de Lattre de Tassigny, commander of the French First Army, requested to see him personally. De Lattre had faced Rommel in North Africa. He respected him as a soldier, even as an enemy. Now he wanted the truth about October 1944. Manfred could have stayed silent. He was 16, a POW surrounded by the victors. He could have repeated the official story. Instead, he spoke. He described the generals arriving at noon, his father's calm explanation, the ultimatum, the 15 minutes, the Gestapo waiting outside, the phone call confirming death. His testimony became one of the first credible accounts proving that the Nazi regime had coerced suicides among its own officers. The boy who had watched his father die became a witness to history. By August 1945, Manfred was released and returned to his mother. His testimony revealed Nazi brutality in a way documents never could. A teenage voice describing a final morning carried more weight than any intelligence file. But one secret remained hidden for decades, one that would surface only in 2001 and complicate the carefully preserved image of Rommel's private life. The secret daughter. A Sunday Times investigation uncovered personal letters revealing that Rommel had fathered a daughter in 1913 before his marriage to Lucy. The mother was Walburga Stemmer, a fruit seller. Their relationship was serious enough that Rommel proposed marriage, but his family objected. She was deemed unsuitable for an ambitious officer. The relationship ended. The child remained. The daughter, Gertrude, was never abandoned. She was introduced to relatives as a cousin and maintained contact with the family throughout her life. She visited Lucy and Manfred regularly, even after Rommel's death. The connection endured quietly, across decades, hidden from public history. Another truth, waiting its turn to be spoken. Walburga Stemmer died in 1928, officially from pneumonia, yet historians who later examined the circumstances have long suspected suicide. They believe she fell into despair. Over losing Rommel to Lucy, and over the life that might have been hers, had history taken a different turn. When the truth finally surfaced decades later, it did not shatter the Rommel legacy, but it did complicate it. The image carefully cultivated during the war, the honorable commander, the disciplined strategist, the devoted family man, was incomplete. There had been a private past the regime's propaganda machine would never have tolerated. The Rommel myth was not confined to the battlefield. It extended deliberately into his personal life, polished and simplified for public consumption. Gertrude, the hidden daughter, outlived them all. She died in 2000, just months before the Sunday Times investigation revealed her existence to the world. She went to her grave knowing exactly who her father was, quietly connected to his family, yet never publicly acknowledged. A truth lived, but never spoken. Lucy Rommel would carry her own silence for 27 years. She survived her husband by nearly 3 decades, living through occupation, division, reconstruction, and Germany's long, painful reckoning with its past. Born in 1894 to a Polish-Italian family, educated in Danzig, fluent in several languages, she was never merely a general's wife. She was an intelligent, perceptive woman who understood precisely what the regime had done to her husband and what it was capable of doing to her next. After the war, she bore a peculiar burden. Being the widow of a Nazi field marshal in a country desperate to forget Nazism had ever existed. Denazification courts scrutinized everyone connected to the regime. Families of senior officers faced suspicion, investigation, sometimes prosecution. Lucy moved through all of it with quiet discipline. She never wrote memoirs. She rarely granted interviews. She did not tour lecture halls defending her husband's reputation or attacking his critics. She chose endurance instead. Her silence was not weakness, it was strategy. To speak would have meant explaining, justifying, becoming part of the spectacle. Lucy refused. She allowed her husband's military record to stand on its own while she raised her son and lived as privately as possible. She died in 1971 at the age of 77, having watched Manfred grow from a traumatized teenager, one who had witnessed his father's death, into a respected public figure. Her quiet resilience became a form of testimony in itself. Dignity without denial, survival without self-pity. When Manfred later rose to prominence, he carried not only his father's name, but his mother's example of how to live beneath history's weight. And this is where the story turns. Manfred Rommel could have disappeared into anonymity. He could have changed his name, left Germany, rebuilt his life far from his father's shadow. Many children of Nazi-era figures did exactly that, dissolving into ordinary lives, their surnames buried beneath marriage certificates or legal changes. Manfred chose the opposite path. In 1974, he ran for mayor of Stuttgart and won. He would hold the office for 22 consecutive years, becoming one of the most respected political figures in modern German history. But he did not succeed despite his name. He used it deliberately, not to glorify his father's era, but to repudiate everything it stood for. He championed immigrant integration when many politicians resisted it. He founded the Stuttgart Pact for Integration, bringing together government, businesses, and civil organizations to support newcomers. He tolerated dissent. He promoted reconciliation. He built his career on the very principles the Nazi regime had sought to annihilate. Then came 1977. The Red Army faction, West Germany's most feared terrorist group, kidnapped and murdered industrialist Hans Martin Schleyer. The government responded with uncompromising force. When several RAF members died in Stammheim prison that October, officially by suicide, their bodies needed burial. No cemetery in Germany would accept them. Local governments refused. Families were turned away. The dead remained unburied. Manfred Rommel, son of Hitler's most famous field marshal, authorized their burial in Stuttgart. The backlash was immediate and furious. Critics accused him of honoring terrorists. Political opponents denounced the decision as betrayal. How could the son of Germany's greatest military hero offer burial to murderers? Manfred's reasoning was disarmingly simple. Reconciliation requires acts of reconciliation. The dead were dead. Their crimes were finished. Refusing burial would only prolong hatred. Someone had to end the cycle, and he was willing to be that person. It was precisely the kind of decision his father's regime would have despised, and that was exactly the point. The Rommel name began to stand not for Nazi Germany, but for its deliberate rejection. Manfred inverted everything his father's era had represented, not by fleeing history, but by confronting it and choosing differently. The transformation was sealed in 2014. Stuttgart made a decision that would have been unthinkable in 1945. The city renamed its airport, not after Erwin Rommel, the desert fox whose armored divisions swept across North Africa, but after Manfred Rommel, the mayor. The city explained that Manfred embodied tolerance, reconciliation, and openness to the world more than any other figure in Stuttgart's modern history. Those were the values they wanted their gateway to represent. Consider the meaning of that reversal. In 1944, the name Rommel symbolized Hitler's war machine. It adorned propaganda posters. It belonged to a general whose armies conquered continents. 70 years later, the same name was honored again, but for the opposite reasons. For tolerance instead of conquest. For reconciliation instead of division. For openness instead of authoritarianism. Manfred Rommel died in 2013, 1 year before the airport was renamed. He was 84 years old. He had spent his life proving that a name does not dictate destiny, that inheritance matters far less than choice. The Rommel family story defies every expectation. A forced suicide meant to silence a perceived traitor ultimately preserved his legacy because the regime lied about it. A 15-year-old witness, who should have remained silent, became history's truth-teller. A widow's silence became dignity rather than complicity. A secret daughter complicated the myth without destroying the family that quietly acknowledged her. And a son transformed a Nazi name into a symbol of liberal democracy. What happened to the Rommel family after the war was not collapse, not disgrace, not erasure. It was transformation. And it began with a teenage boy who watched his father die and chose to make something entirely different from what he inherited.